I'd like to start by acknowledging that we are meeting today on the lands of the traditional custodians, the Gadigal people. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past and present, and I'd like to say thank you for the invitation to be here, and hopefully what we've got to share might be interesting. And clearly I'm not as good as looking as Suzanne, so I'm going to try and offer something a little bit different today. But I think I can expand on some of the things that Andrew was talking about, which might be of interest to some people, particularly around the business models that you might have to look at. So that's what I want to talk about today is you know, what are the business models that will evolve from where you are now over the next 15 years or so. And I've chosen 15 years for no other reason than that yesterday morning we heard that the Aboriginal Housing Office has been in operation for 19 years. And you were saying to yourselves, well, we don't look much different to what we looked like 19 years ago. We don't think that we've actually achieved as much as we would have liked. And then there were other people saying, well, hang on, don't be too hard on ourselves. We did quite a bit in that time and, you know, it was a good start, but it's now time to really accelerate things. And I've chosen 15 years because, just coincidentally, Andrew pointed out that I was in mainstream community housing, and that was some time ago. It was about 12 years ago. And I can tell you we didn't look anything like the mainstream community housing providers look like today. So I thought 15 years might not be a bad look at what you might look like in 15 years and how some of the steps you might have to take 15 years from now. I can remember sitting around a meeting room in Havelock Housing in Canberra, the ACT, with people thinking, what are we going to do? How are we going to pull all this stuff together? What do we need to do to look attractive to banks, to government, you know, to investors, to developers, and a group of people saying, well, geez, I don't know, where do we start? And from that was created an organisation called Power Housing Australia, which is the trade association for the Tier 1, or for about 80% of the Tier 1 community housing providers around the country. And there were organisations like mine in those days who were actually employment service. It was employment and vocational training, and we did housing because we were trying to make the linkages between employment and training and a housing outcome. And we were actually builders and developers, and I understand that we have Twofold who are doing something similar. Is that right? Yeah. So our origination was building, developing, some selling, some holding, some retaining. There are others around the organisation that were head leasing from the state governments, and so they had 100, 200, 300 houses, you know, and they were deriving small incomes from those so that they could barely scratch together enough money to make the repairs and maintenance that needed to be done. They were doing that better than the state governments were, but they were still struggling to do that. And that's what the picture of the mainstream CHPs looked like in Australia 12, 15 years ago. And if I think about it, and from what I understand, it's not too much different from where you are today. Some are much more advanced than that. You know, we know there are Aboriginal housing organisations that are second tier organisations who've got, you know, 500, 600, 700 dwellings, good businesses. But that was the case back then too, and now we're talking about organisations with, you know, 4,500, 5,000 dwellings. So that's the sort of thing that you need to be aiming for, I think. KPMG did a study a number of years ago which showed that the minimum dwellings a CHP needs to have to provide all of the good governance that it requires to attract the main types of people that it needs to operate as an effective business and pay good quality salaries is 5,000 dwellings. Now that was the same information we were faced with 12 years ago. It's no different. It's exactly the same information. It's not changed. It's not now 20,000 or anything like that. It's still 5,000. So that's what's in front of you. Do you want to do this just to house Aboriginal people, or do you want to do this to house everyone? That's questions for you, ones I don't have answers for. When you start to get the scales of 5,000 and 6,000 dwellings, that's when you start to write your own questions as well. Yeah. So, business models. So my quick take on this for you guys is to be clear about the business model that you want to develop. Now, I've just put up 4 up there, and we already have identified that we've got a 5th one in the room from two different experiences, and I might just touch on that a little bit later. Now, if you look at the first one, this is traditionally what happens, and it's already happening right now in this room, I suspect. You've got a stock transfer that occurs, you've got a hold because of the caveats that are on it, it's yours, and then you rent it out. You're the tenancy manager, you're the landlord, you provide a number of services inside those things, inside those buildings, you know, whatever they happen to look like, in whatever you have the ability to fund or to have volunteer support or whatever. That's a typical starting point for a community housing provider, and I suspect it'll be the typical starting point for most Aboriginal community housing providers as well. Over a period of time, you get all of those governance issues in place, and you start to realise that you've got some assets because the government trusts what you're doing now and they give you title. And you go, well, that's pretty good. I can leverage that. As we've discussed, leveraging is just borrowing. It's just a banking term for doing things like that, and it just means that we don't sound so silly by using words that other people don't understand. But you start to build, and you hold, and you rent. So you start to develop construction experience. You start to build. Maybe you start off just buying them, you know, but you're partnering with a developer, a construction company to do it for you. Maybe you bring the stuff in-house and you do it yourself. Maybe your starting point is that you are a builder and you become a tenancy manager. Maybe that's your starting point. But typically that's how it works. And then you start developing another model, which is transfers, build, hold, rents, and start selling. You're going to start to see that in the community housing provider sector now. They're starting to move into special purpose vehicles, just a funny legal term for you know, another company structure. So what you're doing is the security and the assets that are held by, we'll call it the Aboriginal Housing Office over there. It creates another company over here, and it starts taking on some of its risk in that other company. It's called a special purpose vehicle. And it starts to buy and sell and operate in there, okay? All of the funds from that one flow back into that one, and vice versa. All of the taxation concessions flow into the special purpose vehicle. So these are structures that start to take place and start to come at play. And they start to help you to build and grow in a different way to the way that you have been. You can then start being attractive to investors, not just banks, because the first two, the first one, you're starting to utilise, the second one, you're utilising bank debt. The third one, you're now starting to utilise bank debt. You're looking at private loan placements, which I won't go into detail of, but it's another form of debt that can come in, some of the super funds sort of type of arrangements. And you can start to look interesting to social and ethical investors, not just from the point of view of getting a financial return, but you know, actually meeting some of their mandates and some from their members and saying, you know, we want this social infrastructure. Where do we put this money? And this is the sort of thing that's happening in Australia now. Okay. I just threw the bottom one in because I mentioned yesterday about shared equity, and for some of those, I don't know, was everyone here yesterday when I was talking about shared equity? Everyone? Okay, yeah. All right. So I'll just touch a little bit on that and a little bit further down, because there's an intent behind that we weren't clear about. Yesterday we were talking about a product and a pilot program, touch on the intent. But then we start building out this ethical investment attraction, if you like, because you're selling and you're also doing something about affordable housing, and you're looking really interesting. And this is where these guys are now, 12 to 15 years on from where they started, okay? So typical places that sustainable equity or investment can come from, and that's what we're talking about. We're not just talking about bank finance. I mean, you already know where to go to find that. The banks are around on every other corner. You can go and talk to them about that. But as you grow, you're going to need other partners. Even banks are happy with this. They're happy, very happy for you to have other partners because it reduces their risk as well. Yep. You've got places like philanthropy. I can say that word. I can't say philanthropist, but I can say philanthropy. You're looking at funds, managed, listed, unlisted funds. I set up wearing a different hat many years ago, set up an investment in Tasmania for affordable housing and bought into it through an unlisted unit trust, investors into that model. They were interested both financial and social returns. 5 years later, they got doubled their money. They had 30% in yields and 70% in capital gain, and there was 60 houses built for people living in them that didn't have that opportunity before. That sort of thing is replicable, and I can't say that word, and is scalable. You know, so you're starting to see the federal government taking interest in this at the moment, and they're looking at managed investment trusts and how they can support tax credits for investment in housing. So we're going to see more of this all the time. Super funds, as Andrew mentioned, so I won't jump on that. But I just want to come back to shared equity just for a moment, just to explore, because this is an area where philanthropists are interested. Myself and a colleague have done a presentation to Philanthropy Australia. See, I told you I can tell you that word. We did a presentation to Philanthropy Australia, and it had 20 philanthropists in there looking to see how they can directly invest into community housing providers. And we said to them that you can go directly to them. Here's the money. These are the outcomes I'm looking for. The Maya Foundation was an example of that. We've also said to them, you can be the equity provider in a shared equity model. Okay, tell us about that. So we told them about that. And they said, well, that's really interesting. What are the structures to make that work? So we spoke yesterday about breaking some eggs and creating an omelette with community housing providers and saying this is shared equity, let's prove the model. Okay, that once the model's proved, the next stage for us as CFSB is to be looking at how we create commercial models or support the structure of commercial models so we can bring investors into this place. They're attracted to it because it actually provides a great social and financial return for them. Now, this can actually be a model for the CHPs. I said yesterday in the UK, there are shared equity model community housing providers where that's all they do. So they take their builder-developer skills, they match up with investors, and they just put affordable housing product into the marketplace. And that's their way of supporting the outcomes for the people in the communities they're trying to do. I also touched on the fact that it's an option for partnering with developers, and I won't go back into that, but I just want to remind you of the fact that this is when you come to large-scale investment in Australia, and you're up against 100 units, 200 units, those sorts of things, and you've got the major players, Lend-Lease and Mirvac and Stockland and all of those who are wanting to put housing product on the ground. They're usually looking for some sort of concession from the government to help them make that viable. And in return, thankfully, many governments around Australia are saying, well, yeah, you can get a go. We'll reduce that parking over there. We might make some of that public space a little bit smaller, but in return, we want an investment in some parklands, or we want some investment in the affordability and availability of the housing in those units. So we might want 5%, 10%, 15%. They differ around the state, and around the states. And in Victoria at the moment, they don't have it. There's a big debate going on there about the commencement of it, and the Victorian government's mandated it will occur. So these things traditionally have been head leasing arrangements for the next 10 or 20 years. And as I said yesterday, that means their capital is tied up for that time. And shared equity is a way of getting, a portion of that capital out, so they as developers can go again. Okay. So building a shared equity model as a business model for a CHP is not a bad option either. We don't have one in Australia yet as a CHP, but we have 6 pilots and another 4 second stage. They're all tier 1 CHPs from around the country looking strongly at this model. So that's all I wanted to say. And I hope I did Susan justice.
Grab one question for Ken. Same lady.
I just would like a comment about what company structure you think supports a commercial focus but allows you to protect your assets. So we're all set up as, or most of us as not-for-profit. So moving into a commercial world or focus, how can you set up your company that, because often we do a number of different things, so we want to protect our assets but we want to grow business.
You want to go up there, so it goes on. Oh no, Ken, you're over there.
I think the first thing that I have to say is that I'm not a legal advisor and I probably shouldn't go down that track. But there are a number of models that, as bankers, that we see, a number of structures that we see. We see companies limited by guarantee, proprietary limited companies. We see both not-for-profit developers and for-profit developers. And we see versions of those as well. We see trusts, we see a whole range of different models. The general reason that a model is chosen is it provides some form of protection for the owners of that structure, so that they personally are not liable for the debt, and all the risk that's associated with it. So I would just say that you need to pick a model that first does that for you. And the second thing is that they're looking to provide a structure that allows the borrower, their lender, I should say, some degree of control under certain circumstances, in the event of default or something like that. So that, and the other reason that looking for structures is around accountability and transparency. Okay, so if you get those main things ticked off, really the best structure for you is the one that your advisor gives you. And your advisor should be giving you an idea about what that structure looks like based on what it is you intend on doing.
Our experience is it needs to be as complex as it needs to be or as simple as it needs to be. And your main issues around those 3 questions. What value are you actually trying to protect? What value are you trying to create? And what value are you trying to leverage? So it's that mixture. So there is no perfect storm that says it's got to be this, and we see blends.
We see blends.
Yeah.
We see businesses that have not-for-profit structures that bring the tax concessions that they gain into the business model. We see models where they have for-profit structures because they want to focus on selling, those sorts of things. So it depends, and I think most trusted tax advisors would probably, and that's your legal advisor tells you the structure, the tax advisor is going to tell you the best thing that works for you. Most of them will look at it in a way that if they can, they'll bring the benefits of all things into it, but never avoid tax. Just try to do what they can to minimise...
Pay your fair tax.
Pay your fair tax.